One of the biggest trends in family SUVs over the last few years has been the rise of hybrid powertrains. And here in Australia, you can get the Hyundai Santa Fe with 3 engines. There's an old school naturally aspirated petrol V6. For $3,500 more, you can choose a turbo diesel, or for $6,500 more, you can go for a turbo petrol hybrid that has the lowest fuel efficiency claims of the bunch. But does the hybrid really check out in the real world? Because as we all know, lab tests of fuel economy never really check out once you get behind the wheel yourself. So in today's video, what we're gonna do is 3 of us road testers from here at Chasing Cars are gonna jump into these 3 Hyundai Santa Fe's, the V6, the diesel, and the hybrid. We're gonna do an identical loop at the same time in convoy, in town here in Sydney, and also out on the highway north of the city to figure out the real world fuel consumption of these engines. And then once we have that data, we'll know just how long you have to drive the diesel or the hybrid in order to break even when compared to the good old V6 petrol. So hopefully this video will give you some interesting insights and you'll be able to make an informed choice about whether it makes sense for you to spend more on the fuel efficient options in the Santa Fe range, or whether the thirstier but much cheaper V6 petrol actually makes more sense for you. But before we get started, hit subscribe below. We tracked north from just south of the Sydney CBD to the northern suburbs, where we recorded our first leg of town consumption, jumping onto the F3 M1 highway out of Sydney for a decent highway loop. We then topped back up and headed all the way back to our Sydney CBD start point to calculate the second town fuel consumption loop. We then embarked on a decent project of spreadsheeting so we could work out all of the maths, and just a reminder that this fuel consumption is from the Bowser rather than from the trip computer. Although trip computers are generally reasonably accurate, we don't trust them. Instead, we prefer to use our own maths. So for this test, it was Kurt driving the diesel, Andy in the petrol V6, and myself in the new Santa Fe hybrid. All right, guys, why don't we have a bit of a check-in? What are your fuel economy readouts looking like?
From the trip computer, obviously we're doing it at the Bowser properly, but what's your car saying here?
Well, the diesel's 7.4 at the moment, but it's mostly been urban, so it'll be interesting to see how much that drops now that we're on the open road.
Unfortunately, the old petrol V6 is not as good. I'm reading 10.3 right now, but it does sound good, so it's got that going for it.
Interesting, yeah. So we've just pulled onto the highway. We've been all urban so far. I'm in the hybrid and I'm actually getting 6.5 litres per 100 Ks off the trip computer. So it looks like we've got an early lead for the hybrid, but we'll see after doing a decent stint at 110 Ks an hour.
How's that hybrid been running in terms of swap between petrol and electric?
You can definitely feel a few hybrid effects around town, and you feel the swap over more than you do in a Kluger hybrid, but
all in all, it's a nice system. You can feel the torque from the turbo petrol engine,
which the Toyotas don't have, and you can make it slip into EV mode pretty easily once you get a bit of speed on, but it doesn't kind of take off in EV mode like we're used to from Toyotas.
Yeah, on that incline that we were on just before, she trying to keep up with you guys, I lagged a little behind, but she got up to about 5,500, 6,000 revs, so needed a bit of jandle.
In offering buyers the choice of 3 solid engines, a petrol V6, a turbo diesel, and a turbo petrol hybrid, Hyundai is unique in the 3-row SUV segment in Australia. But while the diesel and especially the hybrid sound like cost-saving choices on the surface, it pays to really understand how much these vehicles will cost you to buy and to fuel in order to make the right choice. But first, let's do a quick rundown of the 3 cars here. We requested all these Santa Fe's to be in Highlander trim, but for the V6 petrol, Hyundai only had an active trim on hand. That didn't make any difference other than looking a bit more plain. The V6 petrol is only available with front-wheel drive in Australia due to packaging requirements. It's a 3.5 litre, non-turbo, naturally aspirated, port-injected engine that produces 200 kilowatts of power, or 268 horsepower, and 331 newton meters of torque. Hyundai claims the V6 will do 14.7 litres per 100 Ks in urban driving and 8.1 litres per 100 Ks on the highway for a combined figure of 10.5 litres per 100 kilometres. Meanwhile, the $3,500 Dura 2.2 litre turbocharged common rail diesel engine produces 148 kilowatts of power or 198 horsepower and 440 newton meters of torque, while recording claimed fuel economy of 7.5 city, 5.3 highway, and a combined claim of just 6.1 litres per 100 kilometres. Lastly, the newly launched Santa Fe Hybrid costs $6,500 more than the V6 petrol or $3,000 more than the diesel. It pairs a 1.6 litre direct injected and turbocharged petrol engine with a 44 kilowatt electric motor. Together, the system makes 169 kilowatts of power or 226 horsepower and 350 newton meters of torque. The hybrid, which is all-wheel drive, claims to be more frugal than the diesel in town, with a 6.2 litre per 100 k's urban figure and 5.9 highway, and a combined claim of 6 litres per 100 k's flat. In case you're wondering, in terms of performance, the three engines were remarkably close. The diesel was slowest from 0 to 100 at 8.42 seconds, while the hybrid needed 8.09 seconds, and the V6 petrol recorded a relatively quick 7.47 second sprint.
Alright, well, looks like the diesel's done 6.7 according to the trip computer. For a combined, isn't too bad.
I'm getting 5.9 on my trip computer in the hybrid. That's after everything's said and done, but
We'll see how it checks out when we run the numbers.
Hey, I'm pretty proud of this V6 here because we've just, well not just, but
we're in single figures. I'm looking at 9.9 here, which I mean isn't terrible.
that is good given it's the cheapest of the lot. And what are your guys' thoughts on your engines as kind of something to use in town in the burbs?
Well, the diesel's pretty good, but in eco mode, as we've had it in the test, it's just a little bit lazy in terms of its response. So it can kind of make it a little bit jerky at low speed, but yeah.
Chasing ultimate fuel economy, that's the price you pay.
I'm a fan of this big V6. It's pretty brisk on acceleration and it makes a cool noise, and the torque band seems quite wide, so yeah, I'm impressed.
I think out of all the Santa Fe's I've driven, the hybrid would be the ultimate in-town Santa Fe. It's just so serene.
It's a little funky to get it into EV mode in the first place.
But once it's there, it'll stay there and you just watch your fuel consumption dropping, which is kind of perversely fun. And the results are in. Let's start with the highway, where the V6 petrol did 8.1 litres per 100 k's, which is exactly the same as Hyundai's claim of 8.1 litres per 100 k's. That's good for a highway range of 827 kilometres in the V6. What about the diesel? Well, Hyundai claims 5.3 litres per 100 k's, and we managed 6 litres per 100 k's flat. That's 13% worse, but still really economical and good for a range of 1,116 kilometres. Lastly, the hybrid, against its claim of 5.9 litres per 100 k's, delivered us 6.9 litres per 100 k's, 16% thirstier, and a range of 907 kilometres. But what about in urban areas where these cars spend much of their time? Well, the V6 has a very conservative claim of 14.7 litres per 100 k's. We smashed that. We did 11.9 litres per 100, which is 19% better. It's not often you do that much better than the claim, but that's how it ended up. And the urban range of the V6, therefore, is 563 kilometres. The diesel has an urban claim of 7.5 litres per 100 k's. We did 8.7 litres per 100 k's, 16% worse, and an urban range of 770 kilometres. Lastly, the hybrid, we expected it to do best in urban areas, and it did. Against its claim of 6.2 litres per 100 k's, it was 20% thirstier. It did 7.5 litres per 100. That's pretty good for an urban range of 893 k's. This video is a perfect example of why we're proud to be fiercely independent here at Chasing Cars, and why we like to be so thorough, because it's only through real-world testing where you find out how cars actually stack up on the real roads of Australia. And I think the big takeaway for me is that the V6 petrol is still a very impressive performer in the Santa Fe lineup. It actually does better than its claimed fuel economy in town, and it equals its claims on the highway, and of course it's considerably cheaper to buy it in the first place. But there's a big caveat on buying the V6 petrol that I'll come back to in a moment. The diesel version of the Santa Fe continues to be a real sweet spot in the lineup, particularly if most of your driving is on the highway. And if that's you, you're still going to want to buy the diesel Santa Fe, where it delivers excellent fuel economy on the open road, even if it's a little bit more thirsty in town than the numbers suggest. And as for the hybrid Santa Fe, overall, I think it's the best driving of the trio. I really like the engine. It's a nice, refined, torquey hybrid. It's actually a little nicer to drive than the Kluger hybrid, and it rides really well too. The problem is it's so much more expensive than the V6 petrol, $6,500 more so in fact. And that means that the break-even time is quite far, 6.5 years or just under 100,000 kilometers. The reason being that in the real world, if you drive 10,000 Ks a year in town and 5,000 Ks on the highway, like a lot of normal Aussie families, you'll save $1,000 a year in petrol. But because the car is so much more expensive in the first place, it takes you 6.5 years to recoup that additional investment. But as I mentioned when I was talking about the V6, there's one big caveat, and that's the possibility of future emissions taxing on cars. If we look at what's happened in Europe and other places around the world, governments have introduced CO2 emissions taxes on cars that affect not just new cars, but also cars that are already on the road. And that's where the Santa Fe Hybrid has a massive advantage over the V6 petrol in particular, because this car has official CO2 emissions of just 137 grams per kilometre, which is about 45% better than the V6 petrol. So if, for instance, an Australian government brought in a CO2 emissions tax that penalised high CO2 vehicles and advantaged lower CO2 vehicles, well, the V6 petrol could become much more expensive to register every year than it is now. That's hypothetical, but it's a very real risk that people purchasing high CO2 vehicles are now taking on, and a possible risk that you might avert by choosing the hybrid version of the Santa Fe. So let me know if you're interested in this video, if you'd like to see more of these convoy fuel economy tests where we measure real world efficiency on real roads rather than in a lab, and work out if it makes financial sense to buy the more expensive and more fuel efficient engines. While you're down there in the comments, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell if you found this video useful and you want to see more like it. And as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.